All right, today's video lecture is going to be a continuation of our World War II unit, and this one will focus on the Holocaust. And I don't need to tell you that this is such an important topic for various reasons. As the years go on, there are fewer and fewer people that have survived this event that can give primary source, firsthand accounts of what happened. There's fewer Holocaust survivors, there's fewer German soldiers, there's fewer Allied soldiers that liberated concentration camps, all that can give valuable testimony to this event. And so studying it and knowing the narrative of this event and where you can go to get accurate information is really, really important. This is a famous picture. I actually have this up in my room, part of a larger display about and the world did nothing. This very scared looking kid here being rounded up with a bunch of Jewish people. And one of the most important lessons I hope you get from this topic is the nature of prejudice and persecution. Is it doesn't start with something like the Holocaust. It usually ends with something like the Holocaust, and that's because several things have happened beforehand that have led up to it. All right, so let's look at this. The term Holocaust, which is usually associated with what happened to the Jews during World War I, is actually a term independent of what happened to the Jews during World War I. This term, Holocaust, if you look in your vocab section, just means destruction or slaughter on a large scale. The part that is more accurately associated with the Jewish experience in World War II is called the final solution. And this is where the planned organization of the Nazis to eliminate the Jewish people, round them up and kill them. And it's interesting to note the term final solution, which means that there were things that happened beforehand. It implies just with the name alone. So again, prejudice, persecution doesn't start with genocide. It usually ends with genocide. All right, this is another term that's thrown around here, a term Aryan, something that Hitler used to describe the ideal person that the Jews were not. But he actually didn't use this term properly. This is another vocab term. So these are supposed to be a term for those who descended from the first of the European race. And these are actually, Aryans, historically speaking, are actually people from Central Asia that migrated into a bunch of different places, like India and the Middle East, and eventually into Eastern Europe, things like that. And so he kind of didn't use this term properly when he referred to the tall, bronzed, broad-shouldered, blue-eyed, blonde-haired German ideal specimen. So this term gets, apparently Hitler didn't know history. He was inaccurate with some information. So if that comes as a shock to you, then I'm sorry. All right, these are the badges, so to speak, that Jewish people had to wear in Nazi Germany. They had to identify themselves as Jewish, so this is bright, it's yellow, and it's actually the Star of David, which would have been a point of pride for them. Their greatest ruler in their history should have been a point of excitement and pride, but it became a badge of dishonor in World War II Germany. So a couple of things that the Nuremberg laws that went along with this badge did to Jewish people. First of all, it took away their citizenship. So they're living in Germany, but they're not citizens anymore. And it's important to note that they weren't denied citizenship, although that happened too. The greater tragedy here is that Jewish Germans who were citizens had that stripped from them just because of their race. It also didn't allow them to marry people that were non-Jewish, no intermixing. They felt there was a purity of blood issue that the Germans are really, really focused on. And then they also limited the types of work that they could do. So these are small things. This isn't for large-scale persecution. Remember in a previous unit there was the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. So that was an attack of property that the Jewish people had, particularly their businesses. And so that's kind of more in the area of where persecution starts. And that doesn't usually start with genocide. All right, you know the Jewish people were rounded up, you probably knew that, and forced to live in sections of cities. Like this is called the ghetto, and this is the ghetto in Warsaw. All right, Jewish people, where you can see the tearing down of the wall here, it literally walled in different parts of the city. All right, so the area of the town that was enclosed for Jewish people was called the ghetto. There'll be a section in the video clip that you're going to watch on the Holocaust that just gives you some more visuals on the Warsaw Ghetto. It wasn't just Jewish people that the Nazis rounded up. That was the large part of the focus, but there were other groups within society that they deemed irrelevant that were rounded up as well. All right, so this was gypsies, so these sort of nomadic, wandering people, Polish people, Russians, homosexuals, insane people with mental issues, maybe not as extreme as insane, but mental issues, people that were physically disabled, and people that had diseases that were never going to be fixed. All these people were rounded up and executed, and not just Jewish people, not just Jewish people that fit these conditions, but just people that fit these conditions. And so we can see that we still kind of debate with some of these issues, some of these groups today, and like we're not really sure what to do with them. The debate on what to do with people that are incurably ill still goes on today, and but the Germans included them in their group of unfit people. All right, when Germans went into a new area, they had two solutions for the Jewish people in those areas. And you're going to hear testimony of this, uh, an oral testimony from a woman who described what happened when the Nazis came into her village and rounded up all the Jews. They usually either lined them up and just dug a pit and then just shot them as then their bodies fell into those pits, or they shipped them off to concentration camps. Jewish people weren't just like, we'll get you next time. It was one of these two alternatives for them. For those that what the future is for those who were shot and left in a grave, but for those who were sent off to concentration camps, they could experience a few other things. There's some people. All right, they'd work every day. There's no day off for Sunday or Saturday, if you're Jewish. Their food consisted of a little bit of soup, like a liquid. It's better described as a liquid than a soup, and a small scrap of bread. Sometimes they didn't even get that. If they were in an isolation chamber, then they weren't going to get fed. And what set in pretty quick with this lack of food and physical demands of labor was 50 pounds usually flew off right away, not in a good way. And the signs of starvation started to show up externally on people's bodies. So I'm going to show you a picture here of some people with these conditions that have set in, and you can just see what it did to the body. Another thing to take note here is this is an image from one of the biggest concentration camps. This is in Poland today. The remnants of it are in Poland today. It's called Auschwitz. This also gives you a visual of how they slept in these like bunk sort of things. You can see in most cases 3 people to a section. If you've ever gone to camp and maybe you've had bunk beds, it was kind of not ideal, but it definitely wasn't like this. Another thing that's difficult here is if one person gets sick, it's really hard to get away from that. Everybody's going to get sick. All right, these were the chambers that they were sent into. And you're going to see some of this with the video clips that we're going to watch today. I wanted to show you a couple of, well, before we get to that, the process that Jews went through when they arrived at a concentration camp. There were soldiers, but there were also doctors outside of the trains that they were brought in on who would separate them. These are people that can work. These are people that their fate will be decided right now. They were those that were deemed not worthy to make it in the camp, which unfortunately a lot of times was elderly people, children, young children. They're told to undress and move toward these what looked like showers, and then they were locked inside and gassed with a pesticide called Zyklon B. Both of which you'll hear some oral testimony from German soldiers and some oral testimony from the Jews whose job it was to deal with these bodies after the gassing was done in our video clips. All right, a couple of ladies who led revolts in camps. So not to say, so you don't think that Jewish people just sat there and didn't do anything. Jewish people rebelled. Jewish people fought back. A really good, excuse me, really good video movie I always suggest is Schindler's List. This was an individual who exploited Jews and then began to care for them and spent his life trying to save them by from the fate of the concentration camp by working in his factories. So there's a couple of ladies. This first one, her name is Rose Robata, and so you're just having to write down their names, but I'm giving you a little bit of background information on these women. So she led a rebellion at the women's camp at Auschwitz. She was a link between the men and the women. You know, they worked together, but then they were separated. She was found guilty of passing information and hanged publicly as a display to everybody else. And interesting, this little note here, she yelled out, revenge. It sort of gives me, makes me feel like Braveheart in the movie Braveheart, yelling out freedom at his death. So that sort of thing happened with Rose Robata. All right, the other female, also in Auschwitz, Ella Gardner. So she was helped steal gunpowder from the munitions plant. It was what they worked in during the day, and they brought it back to the concentrator. They were going to blow it up. She was caught as well and hung just like Rose Robata. But these are just really good examples of individuals standing up to the conditions that they face, the persecution that they face, the imminent death that they faced. A couple of individuals that stood up against it. All right, this is a chart here with some data I think is important to look at. But before we get to that, let's define the last of our vocab terms here. So genocide is a term that means the deliberate killing of an ethnic group of people. So that's not specific to the Jews, but it does describe what happened to the Jews. And this is a good chart to look at here because sometimes numbers are impactful. Remember what Joseph Stalin said about numbers. One death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. So when you're looking at these numbers, try not to let it be too statistical, but remember that each number represents a real person. So these are a number of Jews from different areas that were there. How many were there before? How many were killed during the Holocaust? And what percent of the Jewish population that represented? You can see that Poland and the Baltic countries, those new areas that were formed after World War I from former Russian territory, suffered the most, along with the Netherlands. Netherlands is actually where Anne Frank was from, if you know that story. But all total, we have, this is the question number, so there's 6 million Jews that died according to, all throughout the Holocaust. You get different numbers from different people, but this is a safe one. 6 million people died from the Holocaust. So hopefully you take from this that persecution starts before rounding people up and genocide. It starts with something simple, like taking away freedoms, or it builds on pre-existing prejudice. And so that's the sort of thing we need to look out for, because that's a whole lot easier to deal with than this massive deportation and execution of a group of people that persecution and prejudice sometimes ultimately leads to.